Welcome to Divorcelaw with Attorney David Badanes.
Welcome to Divorcelaw with experienced attorney David Badanes. David has extensive experience in divorce, child custody, child support, divorce mediation, and more. David personally handles each client with the personalized attention they deserve. I'm your host, John Clements, and today's episode is Custody 101, What Courts Consider When Parents Separate or Divorce. So, David, welcome to the podcast.
Welcome. Good morning.
Let's start by discussing the basics. What factors do courts consider when they determine child custody, for example, like whether the parents are married or not?
So it really doesn't matter in terms of when the court just makes a decision on custody, whether the parents are married or they're not married. The same factors apply here, at least in New York State. So that marriage or not, it doesn't really matter. The facts are what matter. So the first thing they would look at is what has been the history. Who has been the primary caregiver of the child or children? Who has been, maybe the working parent and not really being the primary caregiver. But all these factors, nothing, not one factor is necessarily overriding than the others. But that's the first thing they would do, is the actual facts of what the history has been. And then the second one kind of follows that. Let's say one parent has been the primary caregiver and the other parent has, worked a typical 9-to-5 job or whatever, but their schedule now changed and they can be more of the caregiver or be available to watch the child or children. That would certainly be considered as well. So those are the first thing. And then the second thing would be, has there been what New York courts called parental alienation? And also sort of the flip side of that is, how are the parents going to cooperate with each other and make sure that if you have the child, are planning to have the child most of the time, how are you going to get the other parent involved? Are you going to make sure that you give them, let's say, the doctor appointment information? You make sure that they have the information about anything going on in school. So they want to make sure that you may not get along with the other parent, but as far as the child gets along, they want to make sure that the both parents, you have a plan to involve the other parent. And then, like I said before, parental alienation is sort of the opposite of that, where you're, for whatever reason, you hate the other parent so much or dislike them or whatever, you're actively either trying to cut the other parent out, or you're saying bad things to the kid, like, oh, that son of a you-know-what, or whatever. They don't want to hear that. The courts want to, the parents are the parents, and they both should be able to love the child and vice versa. So that's another factor. The child's age also can be a factor. As many judges will say, I'm not going to tell a 16-year-old what to do. Now, that doesn't mean they can't, but if a 16-year-old says, I want to live with parent A versus parent B, that can go a long way. But again, the court will take a better look at that. But that is also a factor. There's a couple of other factors we can go through. What kind of home environment you can provide. Of course, if you have any kind of child, young or old, that child should have its own bedroom, those kind of things. Where the child, what school the child has been going to, and let's say they have a lot of friends there, they don't want to necessarily upset the child's life. So there are many things that the court would look at.
I see, yeah. And like to your point, it's more about the facts maybe than the emotions of the case.
No emotions.
No?
They try they try not to go about the emotions.
Yeah, exactly. So I do have a follow-up question about that, because let's say you have a case where maybe the parents are married, but they're going through a separation, and I'm sure tensions are high in a situation like that. How does the court typically handle the custody arrangement initially?
When you say initially, I mean, again, if the parents are living together or not living together, that's two different situations when it first gets to a court. If they're still living together, whether they're married or not, although I would assume they'd probably be married, but certainly not always. If they're living together, and there's one other thing I forgot to mention before, domestic violence. And if there's no domestic violence, the court is probably going to say, well, continue with what you've been doing. You're living together. You've been living together before you got to court, and somehow you figured out how to deal with your kids. They're probably going to say, just keep the status quo, unless there's a reason not to. Now, if there's domestic violence, in any case, that's also can be a negative factor when the court considers custody, by the way. I forgot to mention that before. If the parents are living apart when they first get into court, all those factors I mentioned before, but the court will try to impose a temporary schedule, let's say, if the parents can't work out one. And again, even though it's the initial court appearance, they try to do the best they can to get something that can be worked at least for a temporary basis.
I see. And so we keep talking about the city of custody. So I think it's important, and I'm sure especially legally, to define your terms. So can you explain a little bit about the difference between legal custody and physical custody and how that might impact parental rights and responsibilities?
Very good point, because the term custody does get misconstrued, confusing, because there's really two separate parts to custody. One is decision making, and that's legal custody. And the next part is where the child is going to basically be sleeping at night or living for most of the time. So let's talk about legal custody, because that's a little bit, well, maybe not so black and white, but I'll explain that first. So legal custody has to do with making the major decisions for the child. And that means medical decisions, educational decisions, and religious decisions. A fourth one that is sort of one is what extracurricular activities, but really the first three. And to dive into that a little bit more, we'll talk about religious decisions. Typically, this is not an area of contention, but it can be. The parents typically say, yes, we want our child to be grown up and fill in the blank, maybe their religion or whatever, maybe no religion. So that's usually not much of a contention, but it can be. The second one is educational decisions, and that can be anywhere from whether the child's going to go to private school or public school, or certainly as the child advances in age, what kind of classes they're going to take in high school. Are they going to take advanced math or not, or whatever, and any other educational decisions that have to be made for the kid, the child. Also usually not too contentious. Recently, but again, is medical decisions. Typically, the parents have a pediatrician that they like. They're okay with saying to the doctor, okay, what does the child need? And they'll go along with that recommendation. But, not all the time. So those are the three major areas. And I mentioned before, sort of a lesser one is sometimes about extracurricular decisions. The child's going to play football, volleyball, swimming, go into theater, you name it. So that's legal custody. In terms of resident, it goes by many different names: residential custody, physical custody. And then that again is where the child is going to be basically sleeping or living for most of the time. And then again, a schedule will be made. Child be at parent A for most of the time, and then alternating weekends, let's say, with parent B. Are they going to split the child 50-50? Each parent has 50% of the time, or anything in between, and every case can be different. But when you hear the word custody, can be misleading, because people tend to bunch those two very different issues together. So you have to get into it a little bit more when people just say custody.
Yeah, and
typically they're probably referring to where the child is primarily with.
Yeah, and to your point, I'm not an expert. I didn't know any of that stuff. I never even thought about it. So I'm really glad we have people like you that we can call to make sure that we're clear when we're going through something like this. And so specifically, I want to talk about unmarried parents for a moment. So what steps should they take to establish custody and visitation rights for their child?
Well, if they are unmarried, it's really not much different than marriage people, except for perhaps they've never been living together before somebody brings something to court. Because again, if there's not a court order, there's no one policing. People could do, in a sense, whatever they want, and there's no real. Obviously, you can't do illegal things, but in terms of when you bring something to court, if they're unmarried, and again, we'll assume for your question, they're not living together, so now they have to establish, again, going back to what we're talking about, legal custody, and also where the child's going to be sleeping at night. Clearly, in this scenario, they are living in two separate places. So, the court first is probably going to want to address that. They want to make sure that there's some type of parenting schedule in place. But in terms of your question, I think, is how they can prepare. They're going to have to, when they talk to their attorney, go over what has been the recent history or the history of how they've been dealing with the child before they came into the attorney's office. They must have been some type of, how did they deal with the child in terms of where the child slept or not. I mean, unless it's a baby, there must be some type of history.
I see. So it's going to basically depend. It sounds like a case to case thing to me, like
It
depending on the
is always a
circumstances.
case to case. There's no such thing as cookie cutter. I mean,
Mm.
it really, every parenting situation's so different, based on the parent's employment, when they work, the child, does the child have special needs? Where do parents live? Do they live close to each other? Do they live miles and miles away? There is no such thing as every case is different.
Yeah, which makes sense because there's no such thing as a cookie cutter family. So that
Right,
totally makes sense to
right.
me. So speaking of, for example, like parental care, how does something like let's say the amount of time a parent can spend being involved in the child's life, say they work a lot of hours or something like that, or they live far away, how does that affect custody decisions?
I'll take your latter scenario if they live far away. And I just had a case like this where, one parent lived in Florida, let's say, and the other parent here lived here in New York. So in those situations, really every other weekend schedule is probably not the best for the child. So what the court tries to do is fashion something where the father in this case, or the parent, I should say, and the child can at least have some relationship, maybe once a month, certainly once every 2 months, I would say, maybe more time in the summer when the child doesn't have school. And when the child has, extensive breaks, we just coming off of spring break here in New York State. So maybe the parent that's far away would have it every year instead of alternating. Again, hard to put a exact situation, but that's typically what a court would do is try to say, well, we can't have every other weekend, but let's see what we can do once a month, extend time in the summer so that, there's more of a relationship. And of course, now with cell phones and everything, you can have Zoom and FaceTime, whatever, and calls, etc.
So it sounds like there's multiple players involved in making these joint custody decisions. There's potentially the judge if it's going to a court case. There's the parents' involvement. So can you speak a little more about kind of what that looks like in practice? So like do both parents, do they get to make decisions together? Does one parent make certain decisions independently of the other? Like how does that work?
Well, that's what I was saying about legal custody. If one parent has legal custody, they typically would have the right to make those big decisions. No one's going to care whether the child eats, life cereal or Cheerios in the morning, or generally what clothes they wear. Minor day-to-day things. Court is not going to get involved. It's really the big decisions that, again, who is awarded, so to speak, that decision-making power. So if you have sole legal custody, you get to make these decisions about schooling, medical, and religion. Or if it's joint custody, then you have to make it with the other parent, where you both have to agree. And there has to be a mechanism where if they disagree, what happens then? And a couple of choices are, well, we're going to make you figure it out. In a sense, you can always go to court, but no one's going to have a better right when they get to court. And people don't want to usually go to court. It's expensive, time consuming. So it kind of forces them to both compromise. Or the situations where it says joint legal custody, but if the parties can't agree, parent A has what's called final decision making, meaning that if I say that I want my child to go to Dr. Smith, you say Dr. Jones, and we can't agree. If I have final decision, Dr. Smith wins.
I see. So again, I'm back to your earlier point. There's no cookie cutter solution. It really is going to be a case by case basis. But I do want to ask lastly, David, when it comes to these custody matters, what are some common mistakes you see parents making, and how can they avoid these mistakes?
Well, the mistakes kind of touch on is not understanding the differences between custody. The other mistake is thinking that if they don't involve the other parent, that's good for them. That's completely wrong. The courts are very attuned recently, even in, let's say, the last 10 years, where again they want the parents to cooperate for the best interest of the child. They want to make sure that both parents are really involved. And if you're trying to cut out the other parent for whatever reason, that's usually a bad idea. Another bad idea is, let's say you are relocating and you just decide to do it without court permit, relocating to another state, not down the block.
Yeah.
If you decide to relocate without court permission and then ask for it afterwards, that's never a good thing to do. They don't want you to do that. So the bottom line is you have to think of the child first before your own needs, and don't do anything stupid. I mean, I don't know how to say it. It's almost kind of common sense. I mean, if you had a friend tell you that, oh, gee, I did X, Y, and Z, and you'd be like, why'd you do that? I mean, it sounds so bad. Just put it upon yourself. I mean, you know when you're doing something wrong, so to speak. And again, just because you're no longer in love or don't like the other parent, you have to think of the child first and look at from that viewpoint, instead of just doing something that you think it's right, but if you really analyze it, it's wrong.
Thinking of
many times it's
thinking of the
common
child
sense.
first. Yeah,
I'm sorry?
common sense. Think of common sense. Think of your kid first. That's
Right.
I don't think you're ever going to go wrong doing those things. So, David, thank you so much for your time today.
No problem. Thank you very much, and you have a pleasant rest of the day.
And for those of you who are listening, thank you for joining us on Divorce Law with Attorney David Badanes. To connect with David, visit dbnylaw.com and be sure to like and subscribe and leave a review.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.